Now we'll discuss the diversification and the classification of land plants. At the root of the land plant phylogenetic tree is the group known as the liverworts. Three groups, the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, make up this group that we call the non-vascular plants. Okay, now notice that this phylogenetic tree proposes that this group is actually paraphyletic. But we'll be discussing all of the non-vascular plants together because they have very many traits in common. Most notably that they lack the vascular tissue that's involved in transporting water and nutrients. Later in the evolution of land plants, vascular tissues evolved and gave rise to several different clades of vascular plants. We describe the paraphyletic group, including the lycophytes and the manilophytes, which includes club mosses, spike mosses, quillworts, ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns, as the seedless vascular plants. Much more recently, seeds evolved and gave rise to two different clades, the gymnosperms, which contain many conifers, and the familiar angiosperms, also known as the flowering plants. Now let's look at the paraphyletic group, the non-vascular plants. They're also known as the bryophytes, and at one point, when they were thought to be a monophyletic clade, that was considered a separate phylum within the kingdom Plantae. So the three monophyletic clades that make up this paraphyletic group are the liverworts, shown here as this small leafy green plant, the mosses that I'm sure you're familiar with, and this spiky plant here known as a hornwort. Now all of these groups are very small, okay, and very simple. And as we saw in the previous phylogenetic tree, each of these three clades is thought to have diverged from the common ancestor of land plants much earlier than the vascular plants. The structure of the non-vascular plants is very simple and limits them to growth in only very moist places. Instead of possessing true roots, the bryophytes have these short structures called rhizoids. They assist in anchoring the plant into the ground, but they're not very effective at taking up water and nutrients. These non-vascular plants have to live in very damp areas so that they can uptake water and nutrients through osmosis. The reproductive cycle of non-vascular plants also is dependent upon water. These organisms have male and female gametophytes, just as we studied in the alternation of generations previously, and the male gametophyte produces flagellated sperm that has to swim through water in order to fertilize the egg. The non-vascular plants are also the only group of plants in which the gametophyte, remember that's the haploid stage, is both larger and longer lived than the sporophyte stage. Okay, so notice this green portion of the moss here. Okay, that's the gametophyte. There are male and female gametophytes that look identical to the naked eye. They produce gametes, and the gametes then form this stalk-like structure that grows up out of the gametophyte and is the diploid sporophyte. Okay, within this diploid sporophyte, meiosis occurs, reduces the number of chromosomes, and results in the formation of spores. These spores can then grow into new mosses. Okay, remember that the spores themselves and the gametophytes that they produce are haploid. So only the stalks that give rise to them are diploid. So now let's compare the non-vascular plants to the next group to diverge, the seedless vascular plants. Okay, so early in the history of the invasion of plants on land, the non-vascular plants were dominant. Eventually, when vascular tissue evolved, provided an advantage to the plant and allowed them to invade a greater variety of habitats. Even though the non-vascular plants persist today, the vascular plants have become much more diverse and more abundant because vascular tissue is an adaptation that gives the plants a great advantage in obtaining water and nutrients. So we first see the earliest vascular plants in the fossil record somewhere around 425 to 420 million years ago. Okay, now it's important to note that these plants also reproduced using spores, just like the non-vascular plants. But the evolution of vascular tissue assisted in transporting water and nutrients from the soil upward and allowed plants to grow much taller. Okay, because they had specialized roots for obtaining water from deep within the soil, and they could transport that water throughout the structure of the plant, they were also allowed to invade much drier areas than the non-vascular plants. So notice from this phylogeny that even though seedless vascular plants evolved a much longer time ago than the seeded plants, the gymnosperms and angiosperms, they're considered to be a paraphyletic group. And this paraphyletic group can be divided into two monophyletic clades. The club mosses and their relatives, which are pictured here, and a group that you're probably familiar with, the ferns and their relatives. So recall that we discussed how in mosses and other non-vascular plants, the haploid gametophyte stage is somewhat larger and lasts for a longer period of time than the sporophyte. The non-vascular plants are the only group of land plants in which that is true. In ferns and other seedless vascular plants, the plant spends about an equal amount of time as a gametophyte and as a sporophyte, but the sporophyte is considered to be the dominant generation because it's so much larger than the haploid gametophyte. The leafy structure that we see in the woods is the sporophyte, while the gametophyte is very inconspicuous and small, and this heart-shaped structure is rarely noticed on the forest floor. Now, even though vascular seedless plants can grow taller because that vascular tissue is such an effective transportation mechanism for water and nutrients, they still rely on wet areas for reproduction. The gametophyte has male and female structures that release male and female gametes. and the male structure releases sperm that have to swim through water to get to the female structure. This video here shows the sperm swimming through the water. So let's take a look at the structure of the vascular tissues. They consist of two different types. Xylem is the tissue that conducts water and dissolved minerals. It contains tube-shaped structures called tracheids that are pictured here. Notice this cross-hatching on the tracheid cells. That's a strong, tough structural material called lignin that helps the plant to stand upright and grow extra tall. Lignin is present in high concentrations in plants that we consider to be woody. The phloem is a softer tissue that is composed of a network of tubes for distributing the food produced by the plant. That includes the sugars produced by photosynthesis, the amino acids needed to make proteins, and any other organic products that are either manufactured inside the plant or taken up from the soil. An important adaptation in the evolution of vascular plants is the development of roots and leaves. The non-vascular plants did have some leafy-like structures that were involved in photosynthesis and some very simple rhizoids involved in anchoring the plant. However, we see a much greater degree of cellular specialization between the roots and leaves of the vascular plants. So the roots are involved mostly in stabilizing and anchoring the plant into the ground, while as the leaves that contain chlorophyll and other photosynthetic pigments are involved in capturing light and facilitating photosynthesis. There are two types of leaves. Microphylls are very simple and narrow leaves with only a single strand of vascular tissue. We primarily see these microphylls in the plants with simple narrow leaves, like the club mosses. And then we see the megaphylls, which have branching networks of vascular tissue, which you've probably seen if you've examined the leaf of a deciduous tree up close.